This happened in my senior year of high school. Our house was just outside a small town, in a really nice spot. There was a lake nearby, and a lot of forest around there too. Growing up, I spent a lot of time exploring those woods with my friends. We would build forts, play games, and stay out there for hours. Even though the forest was dense and easy to get lost in, I always knew where I was. It was like a second home to me. Nothing strange had ever happened in those woods until about a year before this. That summer, a person had been living in a tent deep in the woods. One of our neighbors found out and reported it. The police came, and the person was made to leave. I remember my mom being relieved when the stranger was gone, but I wasn't that worried about it at the time. The woods had always felt safe to me. I never saw that person or witnessed any of it. I just know from what I heard. For a while after that, my parents were more protective, and I wasn't allowed to be in the woods alone. However, as time went on and I got older, the rules became more relaxed. That summer, I continued going there with my friends, and even alone sometimes. I knew the area well, and even if I wandered off, I always found my way back. One day, I took a walk by myself after school. It was the first warm day of the season, and I decided to head to the lake. I had been to that spot countless times before. The trail was familiar, and I knew it wouldn't take me long to get there. But even though everything was the same as it had always been, there was something off about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt different that day. I walked along the usual route, following the main path through the trees. After about half an hour, I reached the lake and sat down on a large rock at the edge of the water. I liked sitting there, watching the way the sunlight reflected on the surface. After a few minutes, I heard something moving in the bushes behind me. At first I thought it was an animal, but the sound seemed too loud for that. I stood up and looked around, but there was no one there. I figured it might have been one of the neighbors out for a walk, so I called out, but no one answered. I decided to walk around the area for a bit, just to see if anyone was nearby. As I circled back toward the lake, a branch suddenly fell from a tree right near where I had been sitting. It startled me, and I quickly looked up, but there was nothing unusual. Nonetheless, I was feeling a little uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I decided to head home. I didn't see or hear anything else strange, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally got home, I told myself it was nothing. A week later, I decided to go back into the forest for another walk. This time, I waited until dusk to go. The sun was starting to set as I made my way along the same path. It was quieter than usual, and everything felt a little eerie. As I walked, I kept thinking about the last time I was there, but deep down, I really thought it was nothing. When I reached the lake, I sat down in the same spot as before. I hadn't been there long when it started to rain. At first, it was just a light drizzle, and I didn't mind it, but within minutes, it picked up and I realized I should head back. I stood up and started walking, but before I got far, something hit me in the head. It was a rock, and I fell to the ground. I was never out cold, but I was dazed for a good few seconds. I was on my hands and knees trying to regain my composure. The forest floor was wet, and I could feel the mud working its way between my fingers. I almost fell at one point, but managed to stay conscious. My sight was still blurry, but my other senses had mostly returned. That was when I heard footsteps circling around me. Someone was there, but I couldn't see them. By the time I finally regained my sight, it was pouring rain. I could feel the water dripping down my face, and I looked up. There was a man standing over me, holding a stick. He looked disheveled and out of his mind. He poked me with the stick, and I slowly got up, trying not to make any sudden moves. But before I could fully gather my thoughts, the man suddenly came at me. I turned and bolted in the other direction. I was running as fast as I could through the forest. At one point, I lost the trail and found myself in the thick bush. I was almost lost in the rain, but then I saw a car pass in the distance. Since I knew that was the direction of the road, I went towards it. I was slipping in the mud, but I didn't stop. I made it home and immediately told my parents what happened. They called the police and a search was organized. A few hours later, they found the man still in the woods, and he was arrested. It turned out he had been living out there for a while. There was an encampment set up not far from the lake, but it was well hidden with leaves and branches. We all thought of the person from the year before, but it wasn't him. This was someone else, and I barely got away from him. After I finished grade 11, I had to move to a different city for my final year of school. My dad was transferred for his work, and I didn't really have a say in it. His reasoning was that I was moving out soon anyway, so it didn't matter. Leaving behind my friends was tough, especially since I had a solid group back home. I'd grown up with them, and we were close. Starting over in a new place wasn't something I was looking forward to, but I didn't have much of a choice. My parents had to move for work, and that was that. When I got to the new school, it was harder than I expected to meet people. I was outgoing back home, but that was with people who I knew well. I tried being friendly, but nobody seemed interested in including me. I mostly kept to myself after the first few months. I figured that it was just a single year, and maybe I wouldn't be able to make new friends, even though I wanted to. At some point, a group of guys started giving me a hard time, messing with me in small ways. It wasn't unbearable, but it wasn't fun either. Some might call it bullying, but it was never full-on violent. One of the guys in that group was Darren. He was in some of my classes, and I thought we were kind of getting along. Part of me thought that the hazing those guys were doing was just friendly, and maybe that was their way of bonding. One night, Darren invited me to hang out. I didn't want to get my hopes up too much, but I was excited. Darren and 2 other guys pulled up to my house that evening in an old beat-up car. It was raining pretty hard outside, but I didn't care. I hopped in, trying to act cool, like this was something I did all the time. I was wearing my coolest clothes, and I was ready to chill with some hip dudes. We drove around for a while, just talking and listening to music. They seemed cool at first, and we were joking around a lot. But as the drive went on, I realized we were getting farther and farther away from town. I didn't know the area well, but it was obvious we weren't heading anywhere familiar. I asked where we were going, still trying to keep it light. Darren just said that we were going for a drive, and that there was nothing to worry about. I stayed quiet after that, and just watched the rain hit the windows as we kept going. The rain got heavier as we drove deeper into nowhere. We were on a dirt country road that was becoming really mucky in the weather. It was also dark by then, and the car's headlights barely cut through. Trees crowded the sides, and we hadn't passed another car in ages. I could feel the tension in the air, but I didn't want to say anything. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't want to come off as paranoid. Eventually, we turned down a small side road that was barely visible through the rain. It twisted and turned, and we seemed to be heading straight into the middle of nowhere. My stomach started knotting up. I looked over at Darren, but he didn't say anything, just kept his eyes on the road. After a few minutes, we pulled into a clearing, a desolate spot surrounded by trees. The rain was pounding now, and it felt like we were a million miles away from anything. We stopped, and for a second, nobody moved. Then without warning, Darren and the other guys turned to me. I barely had time to react before one of them reached over and grabbed my arm. One of them opened the door next to me, and I was dragged out. They threw me onto the wet gravel of the road, and I scraped my arm. As soon as I got up, they took my phone and wallet along with the few bucks in cash that I had on me. I tried to ask what they were doing, but they just laughed. It wasn't a joke to me, though. I realized that pretty quickly. Darren looked at me and said,
"You're on your own now, man."
Then without another word, they got back in the car, slammed the doors, and drove off. I was left standing there, completely soaked and with no idea where I was. I stayed there for a minute, staring after the taillights as they disappeared into the rain. I was soaked through all the way within minutes. My clothes were clinging to me, and the cold was starting to sink in. I had no idea where I was or how far I was from town. My phone was gone, and so was my wallet. I didn't even have a way to call for help. It was almost completely dark, and the rain wasn't letting up. I started walking in hopes that I'd find a road or some sign of life. I must have walked for hours, or at least it felt that way. The rain didn't stop, and I was freezing. My shoes were caked in mud, and my legs ached from trudging through the muck. The worst part was that I had no idea where I was going. Every tree looked the same, and the road just seemed to stretch on forever. I was shivering uncontrollably the whole way, and a part of me thought it could actually be the end for me. After what must have been over an hour, I finally saw headlights in the distance. At first I thought it was Darren and the guys coming back for me, but honestly, I was hoping it wasn't. I didn't even want to see them, even if it was for them to save me. When the car got close, I realized that it was actually a truck, so it definitely wasn't them. I waved my arms, desperate for it to stop. The truck pulled up next to me, and the driver rolled down his window. "You need help?" he asked. I didn't tell him the whole story, but I gladly accepted the ride. I climbed into the truck and thanked the man. He didn't say much, he just nodded and turned the heat up. He dropped me off near town, and by then, the rain had almost stopped. I walked the rest of the way home, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. I slipped into my house without disturbing my parents. I really didn't want to tell them what happened to me because I thought they would call the cops. That probably would have been the right thing to do after all, but I didn't want to be known as a rat. The next day at school, I found Darren in the hallway before class. When he saw me walking up, he looked at me and offered a sheepish smile. I didn't say anything. I just walked up and punched him in the face as hard as I could. He went down, and a crowd gathered, but nobody stepped in. They just watched as I beat him up. Eventually, a teacher came and broke us apart. We were both suspended from school for fighting, but I never told anybody what those guys did to me. They gave back my wallet and phone, though, and they never messed with me again. For my vacation a few years ago, I decided to do a road trip to visit my cousin, who had just moved to Denver, Colorado. I was a few states over, and I knew it would be a long drive. I wanted to do it, though, because it seemed like a good adventure. I was 25 and working an office job in the city for the last 2 years at the time. My life was boring most of the time, and this trip was one of the only fun things that I was going to do that year. I left late in the afternoon, because I hadn't prepared enough ahead of time. Otherwise, I could have made it in a single day. I had planned to drive through the night, but as it started to get dark, the rain was coming down hard. I could barely see the road. The wipers were at full speed, but it didn't make much of a difference. After a while, I realized it wasn't safe to keep going. I pulled off the highway into a small town. It was late in the evening. It was almost midnight, and I was getting tired. As soon as I got off the highway, I noticed a street sign for a hotel. I could barely see it through the rain. I managed to find the hotel, but as soon as I saw it, there was a bright neon sign that clearly said, "No vacancy." Since I was desperate, I parked my car and went in to check if there was anything they could do. I went in and asked the clerk if there were any other places nearby. He said that there wasn't much around, so I didn't have any real options. I could have tried to push through the rain, but I didn't want to risk it. Instead, I decided to sleep in my car. I found a parking lot at a bank in the town and pulled into a spot in the far corner. It seemed like the kind of place where nobody would bother me, and I figured I could get a few hours of rest before continuing in the morning. I leaned my seat back, trying to get comfortable, but it wasn't easy. The rain was still pouring hard, and it was hammering against the windows. It wasn't exactly quiet, but it felt safe enough. I kept the lights off and tried to relax, but I knew it would be an uncomfortable night. Before I could even get close to falling asleep, a truck pulled into the lot. It was a raised pickup with extra lights on top, the kind that looked like it belonged in some off-road competition. At first I thought it might be the police. Maybe they came to check if I was loitering or something, but the truck wasn't marked. The headlights swept across the lot, and for a split second, they went right in through my windshield. I thought they might have seen me, but they must have missed me since my lights were off. I watched as 3 guys got out of the truck. They walked around and opened one of the back passenger doors, then dragged someone out. They shoved him onto the wet pavement. The rain was pounding down on all of them, but it didn't slow them down. They started beating the guy on the ground, kicking and punching him. I couldn't see everything through the rain and darkness, but it was bad. It looked like they were going to kill him. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the cops, but I couldn't get any signal. I kept trying, but nothing was working. At that point, I knew I had to get out of there. I turned on my car and eased out of the parking lot as quietly as I could. I kept my lights off so it would have been hard to see me, especially with the rain. The last thing I wanted was for them to notice me. I pulled onto the road, hoping I was far enough away before they realized what was happening. For a moment, I thought I might have actually gotten away unnoticed. However, as soon as I hit the main road, I saw the truck behind me. They had spotted me, and they were right on my tail. They got closer, and at one point, I thought they were going to ram into me. I wasn't even sure where I was going, and I had no idea where the nearest police station was. The rain made everything worse because I could hardly see in front of me. I wanted to drive faster, but that wasn't safe given the conditions. I was driving blind with the truck's headlights blaring me from behind. I just kept going with no real plan. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car on the other side of the highway. I flashed my lights and honked my horn. It seemed to work. The truck behind me suddenly slowed down and turned off onto a side road. I pulled over and waited for the cop to come to me. When he did, I explained everything I had seen. He took down the details and said he would look into it, but I could tell there wasn't much he could do at that moment. He told me to stay safe, and then he let me go on my way. I didn't feel like driving anymore, but I was too tired to do anything else. I found another spot a little farther down the road and pulled over again. I managed to get a few hours of crappy sleep before the sun came up. The next morning, I finished the drive to my cousin's place. I didn't mention what had happened to anyone, but I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the trip.